Great. Welcome back to Mobile Media and Games. This is part 3 of our simulation and serious games lecture, where we're going to be talking about cultural rhetoric. So we've talked already about how games simulate and represent the world and how we can kind of learn about complex and dynamic systems through games, and games are really good for different types of knowing. But video games are not just stages that facilitate cultural, social, or political practices. They're also media where cultural values are being represented for critique, for satire, for fun, for education or commentary. When understood in this way, we can start to learn games as deliberate expressions of particular perspectives. These can be unconscious aspects of a game's ideology, or it can be consciously designed into a game. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the Landlord's game, a game designed to teach players about the evils of land ownership and how quickly one player can capture a lot of the real estate in a city, increase the rents, and bankrupt other players because of the underlying unfairness of property ownership for inequality. Of course, this game was then adapted by Hasbro into the extremely popular Monopoly, in which we all enjoy the pastime of bankrupting our younger family members at Christmas. And there's a lot of games that have kind of attempted to kind of reunite Monopoly with its original socialist origins, originally designed by Elizabeth Maggie Phillips in the early 20th century. I think one of the things I really like about this example is that as intentionally as this game was trying to talk about the evils of property ownership, it can be very easily, with a small aesthetic change and really not very many changes to the rules, just become fun and we don't engage with the seriousness of it. And this is one of these underlying challenges of games, is that you can put war crimes in a shooter game and people are just going to have fun and play it, and not engage with the serious commentary in a way that I think maybe with literature and film we're maybe either more primed or better at kind of engaging with. And this is a challenge for serious games designers everywhere, because how do we get players who are playing, who are in this light and fun way of engaging, to engage with serious and more complicated themes? Give you a bit of an example of how kind of ideology can be unconsciously designed into a game. I'm going to talk about a game called RimWorld, which is a colony management sim. You land on, you're kind of a spacecraft that lands on a planet somewhere and you just have to survive. It's quite difficult, there's a lot of failure, a lot of micromanagement, but what we see in the code of this game is that it defines really, really strict gender roles. So you've got these sims who are kind of interacting with each other while you're giving them orders, and trying to find, and one of the things that they try to do is try and find partners. And so the male characters are constantly interacting with the female characters, trying to pick them up. And from this article of a code analysis of RimWorld, we can see that the pickup lines don't get her down. She, the female RimWorld colonist, receives no penalty to her mood for being barraged by come-ons. But the two men who are in the player's spacecraft who've landed and are trying to survive feel differently. They have a near permanent mood and relationship penalty for Reed, the female colonist, because they keep asking her out and keep getting rebuffed. It's not really their fault. Rob and Boots, the two male colonists, can't stop hitting on her because they're men, and that's how they're programmed. And Reed, the female colonist, is so attractive to them. It's just how they've been programmed. So what the code of RimWorld kind of sets out, right? The thing that it dynamically represents, it's a simulation of landing on a foreign planet and trying to survive. So in creating this simulation, the developer has made these choices about how it is that these sims, these colonists, would act and survive on this planet, right? So there's mood debuffs. If you sleep on the floor in the cold, you're sad the next day. And eventually your mood gets so low, you go crazy and you start doing random hilarious things. But the way that the characters are coded is that the female colonists are 8 times less likely to initiate a romantic relationship. And that straight men always find men unattractive. This is written in the code, that gay men always find women unattractive. There's no bisexuality coded into the game. All women in the game evaluate partners when they get hit with a pickup line. They think men the same age and older are the most attractive. Partners slightly younger themselves are always very unattractive, and partners that are 10 years younger than them are always considered unattractive. But for women in the code, there's no old age cutoff. In the code, we can see how women are just eight times less likely to start a romantic relationship, as in the chance of them initiating a pickup line on another male colonist is just significantly less. And so we can see how this game is programming men to act in a particular way and making claims about how men and women might interact in this scenario, despite the fact that Reed, the female colonist, is just being subjected constantly to attempts to pick her up by men she doesn't find unattractive, but then this doesn't have a mood debuff, and you wonder a little bit about the developer of this game. For some more explicit examples, we can look at games like Resistance, which was created by the white nationalist organization National Alliance back in the 90s, which simulates a race war. Controlling a neo-Nazi or Klansman, the player kills very stereotypical African-American, Latino, and Jewish enemies. For the other kind of propaganda games, there's a great example that's free to play online called Post-Capitalism, which is a short game which depicts how we might reorganize the capitalist present into a post-colonialist utopia. What's kind of cool about this game is that you try to click through, change one thing, and then change another, and then that system changes back. So it's really making claims about both how systems are maybe interconnected in ways that you might not initially suspect, but it also suggests how it might be possible to reorganize our capitalist society into a post-capitalist utopia. An example of a news game, which is a little bit dated now in terms of its play, is called Darfur is Dying, which was created by Susanna Ruiz as an advocacy tool about the humanitarian crisis in Darfur. In the first, it has multiple modes. First, where you're traveling in a well to get water, and the gingerweed militia often go by and you have to quickly hide. In the second mode, you're then using this water to manage a refugee camp. There's procedural rhetoric embedded in the challenge, in learning about what obstacles people face, and that experience of rapidly having to hide kind of gives you, the ideas of radical compassion and critiques of empathy in VR really come to mind here, right? That it's not that you can understand what it might be like to go through, for a person to go through this, but you get a sense of what the obstacles are that people face, and then an idea about the necessity of different solutions. Donating money, for security, for food, for water access. The ideologies that are represented in games can also be a lot less conscious and a lot less explicit. We can think about a game like Civilization. What are the values and attitudes that are present in a turn-based game like Civilization? And again, take a few moments now to have a look at some Civilization play so you kind of understand what I'm talking about. When you start a game of Civilization, there are player characters, but there are also uncivilized barbarians. They never develop their barbarian camps into cities. They can't be negotiated with diplomatically like the other non-player characters can. And they must be destroyed by players as one of the early obstacles in the games. Basically, when you start, there are barbarians going around and it kind of makes it slower to initiate. You have to build up a military before you can go out and continue expanding, but it doesn't lead you into an immediate conflict with other non-player characters. It works really well as a kind of act of balance in the game, because it kind of gives you an early challenge that's easy to overcome, but also constrains the speed at which you develop and makes you act in a kind of maybe more real way. It's not presented as an ethical choice. Eliminating these barbarians is a necessity. If you don't eliminate them, they're constantly going to be harassing your towns and villages. What claim is this making about the world? What ideology is being embedded here in the design of these barbarians and the necessity to eliminate them, to expand? 2017 was the 25-year anniversary of a High Court ruling on the Marburg case. For those of you unfamiliar, there's a Latin term called terra nullius, which was applied by British colonists in their colonization of Australia and disenfranchisement of Indigenous Australians towards the land that they had occupied and owned for 60,000 years. British colonists justified their land acquisition policies by saying that the Aborigines were too primitive to be actual owners and sovereigns, and they had no readily identifiable hierarchy or political order with which the British government could recognise or negotiate with. The claimed inability to negotiate and trade and initiate diplomacy with Aboriginal peoples justified the land acquisition and abhorrent treatment of Indigenous Australians by colonial British. And we see here in an example like Civilization how such similar kind of claims and thought and kind of ways of understanding the process of civilization are being modelled in and implicitly kind of justifying and perpetuating the worldview of early British colonial settlers. And so my question is, do games like Civilization, and Settlers of Catan as a board game is another one, similar one, represent these kind of cultural values that we have towards colonization, that we haven't kind of really embraced a post-colonial way of thinking about the inherent immorality of expansion, growth, and taking kind of Indigenous people away from their lands. We can see, I think, also how social attitudes towards different crises are represented in games in a similar way to how games like Civilization and Settlers of Catan perpetuate this kind of understanding and ideology. We currently lack, right now, answers to solve the crippling crises of our time. Global warming, the near total collapse of democracy in the Western world and in particularly the Anglosphere. We dream, I think, of places where we could start anew, unburdened with debts. Settlers of Catan depicts an entirely virgin landscape in which to move into and expand in an extremely abstracted way. Noting here that the black tile piece is the robber piece, which causes constraints to your ability to expand and just needs to be removed. Settlers of Catan is premised on the notion that all civilization since the beginning of time is about settlement into new lands that are virgin territory. But in fact, the game really is about imperial expansion, a kind of way of looking back and justifying the kind of colonial the colonial history of the Western world. Settlers of Catan is thus terra nullius, a new land as empty as it should be, different from the lands that real settlers actually encounter, which are actually filled with the prior claims of Indigenous peoples. Even if the presence of Indigenous peoples is simply disavowed by the player, this absence is significant, because settlers are serial and the systematic disavowers of Indigenous people. So, to kind of roll back through this kind of this example here, what I think I'm trying to do is, in contrast to games like Darfur is Dying, Post-Capitalism, and Resistance, which are really explicitly games about propaganda, that, you know, the designer has set out to make a claim about the world. What Civilization and Settlers of Catan are kind of doing is they're perpetuating a colonial fantasy, a fallacy that we have about what colonization is, and the ways in which it's acceptable to have a desire for starting new in new lands that are less constrained by past lands, because that's not how the world has been. But I think it's a conscious, or it's a subconscious ignorance of the history of the world that I think is perpetuated by these subconscious ideologies that are being designed and captured in games. So one of the games that we're going to get you to play in class, and Ian Bogus talks about in the required reading for this week, is McDonald's Monopoly. And so this text here is from Paolo Pedicini on Molly Industries, text about the McDonald's Monopoly game. And so one of the things you might want to do is you might want to look at this and kind of understand what he was going for with the design of this game after or before you're playing it. One of the points he makes is that video games have a compulsion for efficiency and control. Video games are the aesthetic form of rationalization. Now, rationalization refers to Rationalization refers to a process of replacement of traditions, customs, and emotions as motivators of human conduct in favor of quantification and calculation. And so this is this process of rationalization on society is a key kind of critique of thing that we critique in kind of Marxist theory, because when we see the kind of rapid process of industrialization in the 19th century, a lot of traditions and customs were removed in favor of quantifying and calculating. And this is something that's only become even more accelerated now with digital computers trying to quantify ourselves into data, right? Thinking back to some of the critiques we had of virtual reality. Strategy and management games. The simulated world is simply presented as a collection of resources that can be extracted. The landscape is subdivided into spatial units by grids or cells, and the actors that inhabit that space are defined by the function they perform. McDonald's game is an anti-adver game that exploits this tradition of play, this rationalization that simulates the world as simply as a collection of resources, to make players complicit in the unethical business practices of companies like McDonald's. In games, players uncritically engage in these practices, abstracted away from the reality and the consequences of their actions. So what we can look at a game like McDonald's Monopoly is, and again, go play it, it's great. The McDonald's video game mounts a procedural rhetoric about the necessity of corruption in the global fast food business and the overwhelming temptation of greed, which leads to more long-term corruption. In order to succeed in the long term, the player must use growth hormones, must coerce banana republics, must mount PR and lobbying campaigns. The temptation to destroy indigenous villages, launch bribery campaigns, recycle animal parts and cover up health risks is tremendous, although the marginal benefit from doing so is only quite marginal. And what I think is really brilliant about McDonald's video game is that this process by which we as players often really uncritically engage with these practices, because ultimately what we're doing is we're just managing resources. We're engaging in this process of quantification, but it's this process of quantification that the game is critiquing. And so by detaching us from it to engage in these practices, we learn not just about what McDonald's is doing, but how the system of quantification is the true evil. This is a game that is a really good example for me of how sometimes players just don't engage with the serious themes. I've asked people who've played this game in tutorials before what they learnt, and one of the best, or perhaps the worst, response was they learned how stressful it must be to be the McDonald's CEO. Not engaging with the learning themes there, despite this being maybe an exemplar of a serious game. Other games, I think, to kind of keep going through these examples, I think historical representations are also really kind of common in games, right? A lot of games are set in the past and represent that past. A genre that I really like is Total War. Go have a look at some Total War games. Playing Total War Troy Saga at the moment. It's a lot of fun learning about the Iliad. But it represents the historical world as a collection of resources that can be extracted for the purpose of war. Mountains and rivers and obstacles aren't culturally significant. They are obstacles for the movement of troops. Historical games are one of the primary ways in which young people are engaging with history, but our understanding of ancient empires is distorted. Total War Rome is one of the earlier games in this series and one of my absolute favourites. And I was totally astonished to learn in a lecture a few years ago that from a comment from a student about Pax Romana, which was a period of, I think, 300 years of relative peace in the Roman Empire. Whereas in my mind, my understanding of the past is based on these kind of games that simulate a kind of perpetual warfare. So how is it that our engagement and understanding of history is being really kind of distorted by the way that we understand games? So a comment I made at the start of part 1 was that for your assignment 3, I really don't want to see chocolate-covered broccoli. Most bad, serious games just cut up educational content and put it inside a game to be discovered or encountered. The play of the game is completely unrelated to the learning experience or goals. Simon Pahert writes, most of what goes under the name of edutainment reminds me of George Bernard Shaw's response to a famous beauty who speculated on the marvellous child they could have together. What if we had your brains and my looks? He retorted, but what if the child had my looks and your brains? As Bogus quite forcefully puts it, gamification is simply marketing bullshit invented by consultants as a means to capture the wild, coveted beast that is video games and to domesticate it for use in the grey, hopeless wasteland of big business where bullshit already reigns anyway. One of the issues I have with kind of gamification is it's actually really just about taking... there's this integral link between what is gamified and what is measured. So only learning which can be closely measured and tracked and represented as scores and leaderboards is kind of attempted in the context of gamification, which is not what I want you to do here. I want you to think about how the wild ephemerality, the tacitness of games can be leveraged to create a learning experience. This is an opportunity for you to be creative. In week 12, you're going to be showing some pitches. The assignment asks you to create images of what the game might look like, and so really want you to think about how you can come up with an idea that gives a much deeper procedural representation of what it is that you want to convey. How is it that the player is going to learn through the procedurality of the game, through that sense of playing? What could you not get if you were just watching, but you need the kind of emotional experience of play to achieve those learning outcomes. Great, so I'm going to wrap up now. I know it's been a bit of a long one this week, but I was short the other week. Next week, we're going to be talking about location-based games, and the week after, we're looking at games like That Dragon Cancer and how value systems are embedded into games as well, which is going to give you a little bit more language for describing how it is that your game is designed to achieve the goals you want it to achieve. So that brings us to the end. Thanks very much, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you next week. See ya.